and what we do, to talk a little bit in more detail about the different aspects of our work, particularly focusing in on that synthesis aspect, because I'm aware there's a lot of interest in the teaching and learning toolkit at the moment. And then a bit more on our key messages for schools in recovering from the pandemic, with a specific focus on the importance of implementation and perhaps the aspects that the evidence can't help us with as much, because it's always important to acknowledge those. So who are the Education Endowment Foundation? We are one of the UK What Works centres. So one of the exciting innovations in the last 10 years of policy making in the UK is the formation of independent centres that aim to give a view on what the evidence says in different sectors. So we have one for policing, we have one for well-being and children in social care. And the Education Endowment Foundation is the What Works centre when it comes to educational attainment, and particularly with a focus on disadvantaged pupils and how we can narrow the gap between pupils from a disadvantaged background and their more affluent peers. And we were founded with an independent, with a grant from the UK government, but we're completely independent. So we are very lucky in the way that we were formed. We were given a one-off large grant of £125 million from the government, and then that grant is ours to spend how we choose, and the government has no role in the evidence we communicate or the decisions on the research questions that we ask. So we're entirely independent, and that's what gives us our power in speaking to schools directly, but also in speaking to the government and saying when we think things are good or bad. And our three key activities, which I'll talk about in more depth, are evidence generation, so finding out new things about what works, be they approaches or programs; evidence synthesis, so bringing together the evidence base, not just from England, but globally, and summarising that in an accessible way. And finally, and probably most challengingly, evidence mobilization. So once you've done that research, how do you make sure that it actually makes a difference? How is it changing behaviors? How is it changing outcomes? And we have a fairly active dissemination arm that tries to get that research into practice. So first off, I'll start by talking through our work on evidence generation. And this is where the bulk of the Education Endowment Foundation's funding is spent. And we basically run randomized controlled trials of different approaches in the education system, which is a very expensive and a very time-consuming process, but one that we think is really worthwhile. So basically, we take approaches. It might be things like giving incentives to pupils. It might be very light touch programs like texting people's parents. And then we'll do that approach, say in 100 intervention schools, and we won't do that approach in 100 control schools. And then we'll compare the outcomes at the end of, say, 1 academic years or 2 academic years. And the questions that we ask come to us through open application rounds, where schools come to us with ideas, or charities or academics, and then we independently evaluate those ideas. So we set up an academic team that are not associated with the approach to provide that academic analysis on whether the approach works. And then the key thing is that we publish everything we do. So whenever we've done that evaluation, we publish the result regardless of how positive the impact is, regardless of how popular the approach might be, either with policymakers or schools. So again, our independence gives us a really strong voice in communicating what works. And it's really important that we communicate what doesn't work. So there are lots of programs in the English education system that are marketed to schools as being incredibly successful, and giving schools good evidence when they aren't actually having the impacts that people claim is as important as identifying those promising approaches. So lots of the work we do might involve encouraging schools to stop doing things that aren't having the claimed impact. But where we find things that are positive, we work really hard to make sure they're available to as many schools as possible. And I'll talk in some depth about an example of this later on. But the key idea is that if we find approaches or programs or training sessions that are having a really big impact, we want schools to have access to it, and we'll encourage them to have access to it, but we'll also build the capacity of those programs so that it's possible, because there's no point recommending something if no schools can actually have access to it. And we've published over 100 randomized controlled trial reports. We've got about 200 projects underway. We've really driven forward that evidence generation in the English education system. I think one of the findings that's been most inspirational for me is the willingness of the system to engage in this type of research. So I think before we set out, we probably were skeptical that lots of schools would want to be involved in randomized controlled trials. But actually, both schools, program developers have really engaged with this, and over half of the schools in England have now been part of an EEF randomized control trial, which is quite an astonishing fact and something we definitely wouldn't have expected 10 years ago when we were setting out on the work. The next area, and I'm sure the area that's of key interest in the Dutch context at the moment, is our evidence synthesis work, and in particular the EEF teaching and learning toolkit. And what the toolkit aims to do is to summarize evidence in a way that is accessible, clear, and rigorous. So it's based on systematic searches. We don't choose and pick and choose which studies go in here. But then we try and summarize the evidence under 3 clear headlines. So how expensive the approaches are, how secure the evidence is. So have there been lots of studies? Have they been high quality studies? Have they been recent? And then how high the impact is. So not just positive or negative, but looking at the intensity of the impact. And each of these topics has been pulled together in exactly the same methodology. So they're all comparable and allow teachers that ability to look across the evidence base in a way that is accessible and takes the evidence outside of academic journals. So we don't want evidence to be hidden behind paywalls. We don't want evidence to be hidden behind very academic language. We want it to be readily accessible so that teachers and school leaders can use it in informing their judgments. The Teaching and Learning Toolkit doesn't tell you exactly what you need to do. We think it's really important that it's used responsibly and as a starting point for evidence. So some key messages that we always say to teachers are, don't just look at the impact, consider the 3 things together. So how expensive things are, how good the evidence is, and how high the impact is are really important to consider as one. But also don't just look at the headline figures, look at the words, look at the research that lies behind those headline figures. So we always try and summarize where there are differences in impacts that can be hidden by an average. And so with any of these approaches, it's possible to do it really, really well and get a higher impact, but it's also possible to do it worse and get a null or at times negative impact. So it's really important that you consider what's lying behind the average. And the third and most important thing that it's crucial to consider is professional judgment. So research tells you what has worked in the past. We summarize what has worked in the past, and it gives a really good indication of best bets. And knowing that generally speaking, when it's been researched, feedback strategies that have been more effective than changing the built environment is a really important weapon that can be given to a professional in making their decisions. But that professional judgment is crucial. So understanding your own context, understanding the needs of your pupils, it's important that evidence should never be used to undercut the professionalism of teachers. It's a useful tool that hopefully empowers teachers rather than being something that tells you exactly what to do. And then the final area of our work is evidence dissemination. And we disseminate research using a lot of different methods. So I mean, the ideal is that we just put research on a website, schools would engage with it and really dig deep and implement it in their own setting. We all know that isn't always going to work, and it's important to have other mechanisms for impact. So the key one that we use is we have a network of research schools based across the regions of England, as you can see on this map. And what they do, as well as engaging with the research themselves and doing bits of their own classroom research, is they think really carefully about how they can contextualize research into their own settings and how they apply it. And using that teacher to teacher dialogue can give really strong and powerful examples of how research can actually be utilized to make a difference for pupils. And having those credible voices of professionals recontextualizing, implementing and applying the research is what makes the real difference. Then alongside that kind of ongoing network, we do things like regional and national campaigns. So we did a campaign on literacy in the northeast of England, where we brought lots of evidence-based programs and built their capacity alongside engaging local advocates as well as the research schools to promote literacy. We've also done things like excellence funds, where we go to a region and we say we're going to subsidize programs that have a better evidence base so that schools can have access to them for cheaper. And again, building that capacity in the system so that where we're finding things that do work, schools can have access to them. And then the final and I guess really interesting one is working directly with policymakers. So thinking about how we might influence things like recovery and changing those levers in the system to promote evidence-based approaches. So a bit then about our approach to supporting school recovery. And I think the key messages here, again, echo what I was saying in terms of using the toolkit. And this, to be clear, is what we are saying to schools in England across our dissemination strategy. The first one is that importance of considering school context continues, and that positive tension between professional knowledge of setting, but alongside really high quality evidence is what gets the best results. Then the key, I guess, pedagogical recommendation that we have is that successful recovery requires 3 distinct approaches. So it requires high quality teaching, which we know is the thing that makes the biggest difference to pupil outcomes. It requires targeted support because there'll be pupils that have additional needs and need additional support. And there'll be focus on those wider strategies. So things like a focus on social and emotional learning, things like well-being that we know have been particular issues across the pandemic. And underlying all of that is the focus on really high quality implementation, because unless these things are done well, and sometimes the temptation will be to try and do 30 different things in a school and therefore do all of them badly, they're not going to have that sustainable impact, and they're not going to make the difference when it comes to recovery. So going through each in turn, the key focus is on high quality teaching and thinking about how evidence can support and inform strategies for high quality teaching. And I think the key thing, which I know has been really emphasised in the Dutch recovery approach, is that focus on diagnosing the problem and understanding the needs of pupils first and foremost. And we've been recommending very similar strategies to schools in England of a key focus on diagnostic assessment. And that goes beyond just attainment, but also to understanding the different social and emotional needs of pupils as well. But one of the key messages across the toolkit, if you look across it, is that things that focus on high quality teaching, things that happen in the classroom, have the bigger impact. Things like really good feedback, things like metacognition, self-regulation approaches, things like mastery learning have really high impacts on average, but obviously still important to do well. And some of the messages we've been talking about recently are about the importance of things like high quality developing and improving practice through high quality professional development. And in September, we're going to be publishing a new guidance report that's looking at the key characteristics of professional development and how they can be improved. I guess the fundamental debate that's been happening in England a lot at the moment is whether that high quality teaching is better if you have a bit more of it. And the evidence here is really interesting. On average, when you look at the experimental studies, which are distinct from, say, the international comparisons, the impact, there is a positive impact for extending school time. It's smaller than a lot of approaches. It's smaller than targeted support and all of those things, but there does seem to be, on average, positive impacts from things like extending school time or summer schools. But again, the importance is on how you go about that. So one of the reasons why that might be having a smaller impact is because extending school time doesn't always mean extending learning time. So focusing on how you can maintain engagement, how you can make sure that as the school day increases, you're not losing concentration or getting additional behavioural issues that actually reduce learning time rather than extending that high quality teaching. Then a bit on targeted support. And this is probably the area where the English response has been strongest in terms of providing capacity building for increased targeted support. There's a very strong evidence base for small group and one-to-one tuition. So there are high impacts when we do engage in targeted outreach, for example, through tutoring to students. The key questions for implementation here, though, are what ratio? So there's a trade-off. Small group tuition is cheaper, but it is also less effective than one-to-one tuition. And different schools will have to have different considerations about budgets and needs of pupils and about which one of those is appropriate. The evidence doesn't tell you which one to do, but it gives you information about the trade-offs that you're engaging with there. Then there's a question on who delivers it. So you might consider, for example, additional classroom staff like teaching assistants, or maybe even peer tutoring, which is a very well evidenced and an impactful approach. Teaching assistants is an interesting one where the variation underneath the evidence is really important. When teaching assistants just end up teaching disadvantaged pupils, they tend not to have big impacts because that can sometimes detract from time with the classroom teacher. But when they're used to provide structured, targeted interventions that the teaching assistants have been trained to deliver, that can actually have really, really impactful results. Similarly, peer tutoring, which I know has been much discussed in the American context, is a really interesting strategy, because when you get older pupils teaching younger pupils, the evidence actually shows that the older pupils also benefit. So the actual act of teaching and reinforcing behavior seems to indicate that impact in terms of months progress is fairly consistent, and you're getting 5 months impact both for tutors as well as the tutees. The important thing there is how you target and support the tutoring and bring frameworks that allow for high quality conversations between tutors and tutees. You can't just say, get on with it, because that won't have the impact. So there has to be a strategy. And if you go to the underlying text in the peer tutoring strand, it gives indications of where these types of things have been successful in the past. And then the other questions are about the content that's being delivered by targeted support and the capacity there is in the system to deliver it. So a couple of quick examples here. In terms of the actual pedagogy, one of the things that we've been doing in England is scaling up the Nuffield early language intervention. This comes from the evidence generation that I discussed earlier. So we've actually run 2 randomized control trials of Nelly, as we call it, which is an early language approach delivered by teaching assistants, but a very structured approach with specific classroom interactions that happen to improve early language for pupils that are really struggling with spoken language skills. And sorry, we have really consistent positive results here, really high impact when delivered in real world English classrooms. And we've actually worked with the Department for Education in England. We've said this is a really strong approach, and they put money behind scaling this approach. So now about half of primary schools in England have access and are using the Nuffield early language intervention. And that's important because there are other language approaches, there are other interventions that have much lesser impacts that we've studied. And so just changing the strategy, even for the same price, can improve impact. And then the second issue is about capacity. So the National Tutoring Programme is the key strategy the government has used here. Lots of schools might want to do tutoring. Lots of schools might want to have more staff in order to actually deliver small group or one-to-one tuition. But the challenge in England has been making sure there's both the capacity and capacity to deliver quality across the system. So we've worked with the government to try and scale tutoring provision and use the evidence to inform high quality tutor provision, so that if you're a school in a rural region and you want tutoring, you actually have access to it. So autonomy only works if you have really good information and really good capacity to have access to it. Then the final kind of pillar after the targeted support and the high quality teaching is that focus on wider strategy. So thinking about behavior, attendance being particularly important as pupils return to school, but also well-being and social and emotional learning. And I know this is a picture that's reflected globally. In England, one of the key concerns at the moment is over pupil well-being and pupil mental health. And it's a difficult crossover because obviously some of this comes directly from the health evidence rather than the education evidence. We have pulled together some guidance around social and emotional learning, particularly efforts and how to successfully explicitly teach SEL skills and how teachers can model high quality social and emotional learning in the classroom. And with all of our guidance reports, that combines a synthesis of the high quality evidence with expertise. So we have a panel that includes teachers, that includes experts, that they look at the evidence and they come up with recommendations about how the evidence can be applied. All of this obviously is available on our website. Conscious of time, so I won't talk through every single recommendation we have on SEL skills and learning. But the key thing here is that schools need to consider things beyond just the academic outcomes, and evidence can also offer a gateway to those kind of strategies as well. Then finally, just to highlight the importance of implementation, which I've hinted at as we've gone through, but sits underneath everything we do. So it's possible to do a practice really badly, I certainly could, or to do a practice really well. And what we try and encourage schools to do is think about implementation as a process rather than a one-off event. So what's the process for identifying the challenges that your pupils face, and then planning for how to implement a strategy before that strategy comes into the school. Then how do you go about assessing whether it's working, having constant check-in times, and then finally thinking about how it's sustained. So lots of approaches might be really successful for the first year, but unless there's that effort to sustain and embed an approach across the school, it won't have that prolonged impact. And we know that prolonged strategies are what's required to combat some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on pupils' learning. And also, and finally, it's really important to also think about how you might de-implement things. So we shouldn't focus just on what's the additional things we're going to do in response to COVID. We should think about what are the things we're going to stop doing. And it's important that evidence can also inform that. And we should think about good approaches to de-implementing things. So a few conclusions. Evidence can really be supportive in schools' recovery efforts. It can give us that gateway. It can give us those best bets of things that have worked in the past, but it needs to be combined with professional expertise, and access to high quality evidence alone isn't going to be enough. But combining high quality teaching, targeted support, and consideration of wider strategies, including student well-being, we think is probably the best bet for schools' focus on recovery. But then again, always choosing the right strategy is not enough, and it's possible to do anything badly. And we should not just focus on evidence, but we should focus on how we're applying that and how we have really strong ongoing implementation cycles. And hopefully I've got time for a few questions. Apologies, there's a lot to cover.